Today, we're going to talk about how to develop intrinsic motivation. So a lot of the people that I work with will come into my office and say, I'm stuck in this loop of extrinsic motivation. If I have a deadline, I can work for 24 hours at a stretch. But the moment that the deadline goes away, I'm not able to work at all. I wish there was some way where I could take my bursts of productivity, because I know I'm capable of doing it, and be able to do it without this extrinsic deadline. And this is the struggle of internal versus external motivation. And the really scary thing is that many of these people who struggle with extrinsic motivation will do a lot of stuff that actually sabotages them further. And at the top of the list is a lot of these productivity hacks. If you're someone who focuses on optimizing your life, if you're someone who's focused on maximizing efficiency, there's a really good chance that you are actually sabotaging your intrinsic motivation. Now, this is something that used to be kind of confusing, but we've had so much neuroscience research recently where we've basically figured this out. And here's the big thing that is shocking to a lot of people. Your brain has two circuits, an extrinsic motivational circuit and an intrinsic motivational circuit. The key thing about these circuits is that they inhibit each other. So if your extrinsic motivational circuit is active, it will literally shut off your intrinsic motivational circuit. The cool thing is that it works both ways. So if you can make the switch from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation, you will find yourself being impervious to a lot of extrinsic things, like what people think about you, the judgments of other people, needing to do things for money, sort of all of this ego-based stuff will actually naturally start to melt away as you become more intrinsically motivated. So now the question becomes, how do we do this? And we're going to start with something called the undermining effect. And what this means is that when your external motivation circuitry is active, it actually sabotages or inhibits your intrinsic motivation circuitry. So what that means is that you can't be motivated by both things. And now we're going to take it one step further, because people have basically figured out exactly what is going on in the brain. So this is going to be a bit neuroscience dense, and I'll explain it, but I want to show you all this, okay? First, extrinsic reinforcers have elicited amygdala, ACC, VMPFC, OFC, and ventral striatum or nucleus accumbens activity in healthy subjects that was associated with higher self-reported extrinsic motivation, but lower self-reported intrinsic motivation. So I know this is complicated, but basically all of these brain regions are associated with extrinsic motivation, but associated with lower intrinsic motivation, okay? Others report that intrinsic motivation, so if all these circuits are turned on, we're extrinsically motivated. Others report that intrinsic motivation was associated with deactivation in the amygdala, dorsal ACC, dorsomedial striatum, and insula during puzzle onset task. This is another piece of evidence linking neural deactivation to intrinsic motivation. So basically what this is saying is there's all these circuits in the brain, things like your nucleus accumbens, things like your dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, orbitofrontal cortex. When all of these things are active, we are extrinsically motivated. When we deactivate these, we are intrinsically motivated. And this is why it's so hard to become internally motivated while you live in a life that has a lot of extrinsic motivations. Literally, there is a set of circuits in the brain. When these circuits are turned on, you are externally motivated. When these circuits are turned off, you are internally motivated. So you can't cultivate internal motivation while you are surrounded by external reinforcers. So then the question becomes, how do we develop internal motivation? So this is where the first thing that we're going to do is pay attention to a couple of things that we do that actually sabotage our internal motivation. And that is a focus on optimization and efficiency. Hey y'all, if you're interested in applying some of the principles that we share to actually create change in your life, check out Dr. K's Guide to Mental Health. And if you kind of tunnel down, okay, why aren't you motivated? And they're like, well, there's no point. And if you get underneath, there's no point, what you ultimately find is hopelessness. So what the yogis discovered is that what we call motivation, they actually called a concentrated mind. What's the difference between someone who actually does stuff and someone who just tries to do stuff? So check out the link in the bio and start your journey today. When we try to optimize our life, when we try to be more efficient, what are we actually doing? We're saying, okay, as I want to be incredibly efficient, I'm trying to get more out of the world for my efforts, right? So I want to work 1 hour and I want to make $1,000, not make $100. So if we sort of think about that optimization and that efficiency, what is that doing in our brain? That is actually trying to optimize our external motivation. As long as you are focused on efficiency and optimization, it will be incredibly hard to be internally motivated. And I've worked with some people who are like celebrities, artists, musicians, authors. And what I find with them is that there's sort of this artistic pursuit that is internally driven. It's not about optimization. It's not about efficiency. It's not about getting the most written in the shortest amount of time. It's about creating something. They're not actually focused on optimization and efficiency. So if you're focused on optimization and efficiency, you are going to be activating these parts of the brain, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex, even the ventral striatum and the nucleus accumbens. All of these will be focused on optimization or efficiency. So I know it sounds insane, but the first thing you need to do is cut out all of the productivity hacks. Those are only reinforcing your external motivation. The second thing that we got to talk about is dopamine. So although it has long been known that dopamine transmission subserves motivational processes, some evidence suggests that it is particularly important for intrinsic motivation. For example, mesolimbic dopamine contributes to exploration for the sake of interest, and novel and unexpected stimuli elicit phasic dopamine spikes in rodents. In patients with depression, deep brain stimulation of dopaminergic brain regions, including the NAC and the mesolimbic dopamine projections from the VTA, increased subjective interest in and motivational energy for previously enjoyable activities. Moreover, increasing dopamine in rodents increases their willingness to exert effort. And this has been replicated across species, including pharmacologic manipulation in humans. So this is where dopamine becomes critical for intrinsic motivation. Let's understand why. So when my brain is turned in an external motivational mode, I get all kinds of reinforcement from the outside, right? That's the whole point of extrinsic motivation. I'm going to exert effort. And when I get some kind of reward, the reward comes from outside. Now, there's some overlap that'll also trigger dopaminergic dopaminergic neurons. But basically, I'm oriented towards pleasure from the outside. In order for you to be intrinsically motivated, that means that your pleasure must come from within. And where is our subjective sense of pleasure that comes from within? It's mediated by dopamine. So this is what's really tricky, is the dopaminergic circuit is the link between the extrinsic and intrinsic motivational system. If my dopamine comes from the outside, if I use something like cocaine, that means that my dopamine is coming from the outside. Then my dopaminergic circuitry empties out. And then once I start using cocaine, it becomes really, really hard to intrinsically motivate myself. So if you want to be intrinsically motivated, if you want to cultivate internal motivation, you need enough dopamine in your brain so that when you do something autonomous, when you do something that is exploration-oriented, when you do something that is curiosity-oriented, instead of money-oriented, instead of getting the bitches-oriented, instead of impressing people-oriented, that dopamine is there to reinforce that circuitry. So as we engage in dopaminergic activities, our internal motivation will start to go down. Not too surprising, right? Because those of us that engage in a lot of dopaminergic activities, video games, drugs, pornography, take your pick, social media, we find ourselves being less intrinsically motivated. So we need to conserve our dopamine for intrinsic motivation. Now the question becomes, how do we actually generate internal motivation? Where does that actually come from? What do we need to do to shut off our extrinsic motivation circuitry and turn on our intrinsic motivation circuitry? So this is something called the Rubicon model, which has a few steps, okay? Option generation, option selection, anticipation, consumption, learning, and evaluation, okay? So we're going to start by explaining option generation. So the first thing that you want to do is literally generate options. Think about what your options are. So this is what's kind of wild about this, okay? See, extrinsic motivation comes from your brain. Certain regions of the brain are active. If those regions of the brain are active, you will be externally motivated. Now, this is the really crazy thing about this. This doesn't mean that you will be externally motivated in one direction and internally motivated in a different direction, right? That doesn't mean like once my job makes me externally motivated, my brain is shaped in an externally motivated way, which means my job will influence me to be externally motivated. And then that same brain, which has been activated in this way in my job, will then be, that's the same brain that responds to my dating life, responds to my personal fitness, responds to my financial goals. This is the crazy thing that I'm going to say again, because I really want y'all to understand this. Once your brain gets switched into external motivational mode, and that can happen by your job or some circumstance outside of you, that brain will then be externally motivated towards everything else because now these circuits are on and the internal motivation circuits are off, which means that if we can switch it around, if we can disable those circuits in one dimension of our life, we will find ourselves being internally motivated in every dimension of our life. This is how we literally fix the problem. Now, this is the other really interesting implication here, which is that if we simply activate internal motivation in one area of our life, that brain activation will carry over to other areas. So if you go through this process, you will become more internally motivated. This is why when we work with coaches, sometimes we'll do this thing called case review, which is when coaches come in and they ask us they'll present their cases. They'll say, hey, Dr. K, I have a client. They're struggling with this, struggling with this. I feel like I can't help them. They feel overwhelmed. Their client's life is falling apart. They don't have a job. They don't have a girlfriend. They don't have a boyfriend. They're out of shape. Their mental health is in the pits, and they feel like they can't fix this. The cool thing is that we focus on purpose, we focus on internal motivation, we focus on moving forward in one direction. And then every dimension of their life gets better. There's the saying that we have in psychiatry that all boats rise together. When you get physically ill, you get mentally ill. When you get mentally ill, your job suffers. When your job suffers, your spouse is unhappy. Right? Everything falls apart at the same time. And this is why this is so critical, because if y'all can do this in one dimension of your life and not keep on sabotaging the other dimensions of your life, this will translate over into every dimension of your life, okay? So anytime you are faced with a task or goal, what you want to do is generate options. Generate option A, B, C, D, whatever. Doesn't matter how many there are. But what we want to do is generate options. Why? So if you're someone who's externally motivated, chances are you feel out of control in life. You are reacting to life's circumstances, right? You're not in control. If your boss says this deadline, then you're like, oh my God, I have to do this deadline. If there's a test that you have to study for, then you can study for 24 hours. But you are basically living a reactive life, not a proactive life. The first step that you can take from shifting from a reactive to a proactive life is to generate options. So if I'm over here and my boss says option A or option B, I feel like I'm out of control. I have to choose between these two things. Literally switching that around is A, B, and D. This is literally as easy as it is. This will turn on certain parts of your brain that will then cascade into more internal motivation. So when you do this, I want y'all to just think about how that will change your life, right? So let's say you have a weekend coming up and you're like, okay, instead of just approaching the weekend reactively, stop and think about it on Friday at 5 p.m. What do I want to do this weekend? Sit down, grab a piece of paper, think about what your options are. How can I spend the weekend? When I work with clients who are addicted or patients who are addicted, right, they don't do that. They're sort of like, oh my God, now that it's Friday, I feel so exhausted. Let me just start playing video games and I'm going to order a pizza. Now I feel hungry, so I'm going to order pizza. I'm going to order food delivery. So I don't know if this kind of makes sense. This is what's another really crazy thing, but responding to drives in your body is actually external motivation, right? Satisfying hunger is not internal motivation. Even though it comes from within you, you are still responding to something from your environment. Your body is technically part of your brain's environment, right? That's literally what it is. Your brain exists within your body, and your body sends the brain all kinds of signals. We're hungry, we're thirsty, whatever. So it starts with something as simple as considering your options for the weekend. What do I want to do this weekend? This changes the tone from I'm responding to this and now I feel like doing this and now I feel like I have to do that. I can't afford to do that. I don't have enough energy to do that, to this is what I want to accomplish over the course of the weekend. This is what I'm going to do over the course of the weekend. Switches things around. Second thing that we're going to do is anticipation. This is a critical cognitive step that a lot of people don't do. Okay? And the reason that they don't do that is because these parts of their brain are shut off by the extrinsically motivated parts of the brain. So then what we want to do is, once we have our 5 options, we want to anticipate like what is going to happen. So if I do this, what will happen? 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 So it turns out that a big part of our motivation has to do with something called reward prediction errors. One theory suggests that motivated action is driven solely by a need to reduce reward prediction errors, or the mismatch between expectation and outcome, okay? The key thing here is that if we spend some time anticipating what we will get from our options, and this is critical to understand, this is a huge thing that people miss. It's not even about doing A, B, C, or D. It is not about whether your anticipation is right or wrong. The key thing here is this is literally how you turn on the internal motivational circuitry. So think through the consequences of your actions. Now, there's another subtlety here that I think is really important. Notice that option generation and anticipation has nothing to do with achieving the reward, wanting the reward, preferring one thing over another. This is not about money or love or anything like that. That's not what I'm talking about. This is subtle, so I'm going to emphasize it, okay? Simply the process of generating options and anticipating what will happen if you engage in those options. That has nothing to do with the actual rewards. This is a cognitive exercise to generate options and engage in anticipation. Then what we want to do is plan and act. Once we've generated some options, we want to try to plan to make that work. So ask yourself the question, how can I do this in the easiest way? What are the behaviors that I can engage in that will help me actually stick with option A instead of option D? So spend some time thinking about it. That's going to recruit your frontal lobes in the right way, and then try to act. Now, when you try to act in this way, there's a really good chance that it will be hard. And why is this going to be hard? Because right now, chances are your external motivational circuitry is active. So here's what's going to happen when you try to act. Preclinical findings further show that photostimulation of GABAergic amygdala projections modulates extrinsic motivation, okay, without affecting intrinsically motivated behavior. So what does this mean? So GABAergic amygdala projections are basically our negative emotional circuitry projections. So as you try to act in this way, you will feel negative emotions. And why will you feel negative emotions? Because this has to do with extrinsic circuitry. Here's the way that these negative emotions are going to work. Your brain will literally tell you, what's the point? Your brain will tell you, I don't really feel like it. Your brain will tell you, what do we gain by doing this? Your brain will tell you, what comes next? What's the point of doing this unless we're going to get something out of it? That is literally these parts of your brain activating. These are the extrinsically motivated parts of your brain that don't want to act because you want to. They only want to act if you get something. So be prepared for that. As best as you can, plan and act. Next thing that we want to do is reflect, okay? So this also becomes really important because when we are extrinsically motivated, there's a major step that we don't do, which is that we don't reflect. We move on to the next thing. So I don't know if y'all have ever experienced this, but when I would study really hard for finals, the moment that finals were over, I would do my best not to think about it. I'm done. I'm finished. Oh my God, I'm done. Now it's time to party. You immediately move on to the next thing. Once you get an extrinsic reward, once you get promoted, once you get what you wanted, you are immediately moving on to something else. You do not pause and reflect. Pausing and reflecting is the way that you engage with your internal motivational circuitry. So whether you succeed, whether you fail, that actually doesn't matter. Remember, we're not focused on achieving a goal. We are focused on recalibrating our brain to be internally focused. So once you plan and you act, then you're going to pause and reflect. And this is the crazy thing. It doesn't matter what you reflect on. All that matters is turning on these parts of the brain. And so this is where what I would encourage y'all to do is, even if you did a good job, ask yourself, what is it that made me do a good job? What is it that helped me do a good job? If y'all failed or you didn't achieve what you wanted to, ask yourself, okay, what did I do wrong? What can I do better next time? We want to focus internally, right? So don't focus on beating yourself up. That's where your brain may go. You may get that amygdala GABAergic activity that activates, and then you feel shame, and then you feel fear and things like that. Extrinsic motivation, by the way, is very emotional in nature, right? So a lot of our extrinsic motivation is the avoidance of emotions. And once we start to feel negative emotions in some way, oh my God, my boss is mad at me, let me do this thing so they're no longer mad at me, and then I feel better. So reflect in some way about what you did right, what you did wrong. Kind of doesn't matter, whatever you feel like reflecting. The key thing is that you spend some time with yourself. The last thing that we're going to talk about is locus of control. So one explanation for the undermining effect suggests that the presence of an external reinforcer shifts one perception of locus of control over the behavior from internal to external. So this is another feature that kind of explains why you can't be intrinsically and extrinsically motivated. So there's this concept in psychiatry called locus of control, which is basically this core idea of when something happens in your life, what is responsible? Are you responsible, or is something outside of you responsible? And I'll give you all a couple of simple examples. So if you apply for a job and you don't get it, there are some people who will think, oh yeah, the reason I didn't get the job is because this person's nephew was applying, and since there's nepotism, there's no way I can get the job. This is someone who believes the way that their brain frames the situation. I don't care if it's true or not, okay? I want y'all to think about this from a cognitive perspective. The reason for this thing happening in this way is something outside of your control. Whereas someone with an internal locus of control may acknowledge, sure, this person's nephew was applying to the position, but if my resume was better, if I interviewed better, if I prepared for my interview better, if I worked harder, if I was more charming or charismatic, then maybe I would have gotten the job. So one of the key things that's really different is when people go through life, some people have an internal locus of control. We have a whole video on it, so y'all can check that out. But the locus of control is basically, in a given situation, who is responsible? Are you responsible, or is the outside world responsible? Now, this is where the reality of the situation is that it's a mix of the two, right? Even if I do everything right, I can't have a perfect life. Even if I do everything right, it doesn't mean that exactly what I want is going to happen. But what we do know is that people who are extrinsically motivated have more of an external locus of control. They believe that they are not in control of their lives. So the last thing that I would encourage y'all to do to become internally motivated is notice anytime you have an external locus of control kind of thought. Yeah, I'm single because women are this way. I'm single because dating is a mess. And I'm not saying that dating isn't a mess. There's a lot of evidence that dating is a mess. But there are a lot of people who are able to still find partners. And if we look at people who will say like, oh yeah, it's impossible for me to find a girlfriend. Why? Oh, because of my jawline. That is an external locus of control. That is something outside of you that is responsible for your situation. So shift your locus of control. If you do these things, it will shift your brain from an externally motivated state to an internally motivated state.